Welcome to Challenging Climate, a podcast where we discuss the science, technology, and politics of climate change. I'm Jesse Reynolds, an environmental policy expert.
And I'm Pete Irvin, a climate scientist. Each episode, we bring on a guest with a unique perspective and deep expertise on climate change, and we put challenging questions to them.
In this episode, we spoke with Neal Stephenson, who is a leading author of speculative fiction and speculative history. And throughout his writing, technology plays a big role. He's the recipient of the Hugo and Prometheus Awards. He's perhaps best known for his novels Snow Crash and Cryptonomicon. His most recent book, Termination Shock, explores a scenario of the use of solar geoengineering in the not-too-distant future. For those listeners new to the idea, solar geoengineering is a set of proposed techniques to artificially cool the planet in order to reduce climate change. The leading proposal would replicate volcanic eruptions' natural cooling effect by spraying small particles into the upper atmosphere.
And yeah, it was great to have Neal on. Jesse and I both work academically on solar geoengineering, and I think it's really interesting to see very accomplished fiction writers take on this topic, because I think science fiction and fiction in general can help us explore issues that are kind of to some extent out of reach of academia or not well covered there. So I think it's really interesting to have him on and really interesting to see him getting involved. And I really enjoyed our conversation.
Another layer that I think he added is that he is not deep into climate change and environmental issues in the past. And that can actually be an asset by bringing some fresh eyes to the question of climate change and technology and solar geoengineering. Such a perspective can help shake people up, perhaps act as an antidote to the risk of groupthink.
And overall, it was a great conversation, so we all enjoy it.
Welcome to the podcast, Neal.
Thanks for inviting me to join you.
Well, hi, Neal. I guess first off, could you explain to our audience what your new book is about?
Of course. It's meant to be a techno thriller that is on the subject of climate change and geoengineering. And I have tried to present what I think is a frank account of where we are and how things might look in the coming decades and some of the ways that people might react to that situation. So more specifically, what I'm depicting here is a situation in which an individual actor, a lone billionaire in Texas, decides that he's going to unilaterally implement a solar geoengineering scheme. In other words, as people who listen to your podcast may know, he's going to, in this case, inject a layer of sulfates into the stratosphere using a large gun as a way of blunting the effects of rising temperatures on the global climate. So that is all sort of a fait accompli at the beginning of the book, although we don't see it until we're a few chapters in. And so really what the book is about is the geopolitical knock-on effects. So what do people think of what this man has done? How does it affect different regions, different countries in different ways, and how do different people respond depending on how their own national interests might be affected?
It seems that you've written little on environmental issues over the course of your book. So I think, if I'm right, your second novel, Zodiac, has quite an environmental theme. So yes. What drew you to focusing on climate change and solar geoengineering?
Well, you're right that my second novel, Zodiac, was described as an eco-thriller, but it didn't have anything really to do with climate change. It was about toxic waste. In this case, I guess that I've had a growing consciousness and awareness of the severity of the problems that we're facing over the last couple of decades. And almost 10 years ago, I actually spent a while working with a little study group that was looking at a form of possible carbon capture. We sort of moved away from that project when we began to run the numbers and started to understand just how much carbon has to be removed from the atmosphere in order to make any substantive difference, and realized that it was something that would have to be implemented on an incredibly enormous scale. So that was kind of the when I first became a little bit more conscious of these things. And I guess in 2019, having delivered my previous book, Fall or Dodge in Hell, and looking around for what I would write next, it just suddenly became clear to me that this is such an enormously important issue. That it seemed a bit odd that I hadn't tackled it yet. And I began to feel as though, given that my niche as a writer is supposed to be writing approachable books on technical subjects, that it behooved me to take a crack at climate change.
Do you think it would have been much harder to take on climate change if you weren't able to use the idea of solar geoengineering as a hook?
I think it is a particularly good hook because it, a few reasons. One is that by its nature, when you tell a solar geoengineering story, you're telling a story that involves a big technology project. I mean, in my case, it's a large gun system, but people have also talked about using balloons. They've talked about using special airplanes. They've even talked about space-based solar geoengineering, where objects are put into orbit to bounce back the sun's rays. But however you slice it, it's always a big technology project, and big technology projects could just kind of lend themselves to science fiction storytelling. It gives you as kind of a structure to build a story around. So that's part of it. And then another part is the geopolitical angle, the fact that any solar geoengineering scheme is going to have globally distributed effects. And so it immediately gets you into all kinds of possible plot ideas in that area. And finally, it's I don't want to use the word hopeful or optimistic because I don't think that exactly captures it, but it is a way to talk about something other than we're all going to die.
That is something that also struck me. I one of the things that that's kept me a bit away from indulging too much in science fiction broadly defined as kind of a dystopian bent to it. And I found that this book, and I recently read another one of your books to get a sense about where you're coming from, it's mixed. There's challenges, there's opportunities of technology that can address problems to some degree, but it's not smooth sailing. It's also not a utopian story either.
Right.
What I've seen across common in your books is something you just mentioned is the technical aspect. Right? You have an attention to technical detail. It wasn't extremely deep in this book. I also read Seven Eves, and that goes in a bit more depth. I'm curious, how do you go about background research, getting up to speed? Because as far as I could see on the solar geo side, you had dotted your I's and crossed your T's. At a technical and physical level, it held together.
Right. So I grew up in an academic family in an academic town that was geared towards science and engineering. My educational background is in technical subjects. I didn't go terribly far I have a bachelor's degree and that's it. But I've maintained or tried to maintain my contact with that world since then. And I'm a heavy user of Mathematica, which I've found to be a really valuable kind of general tool for doing kind of somewhere beyond back of envelope calculations. And so, but obviously not at the level of serious engineering. But it's kind of in the right Goldilocks zone between those two extremes, and enough to make me feel as though I'm not grossly violating the laws of physics, and that the things I'm describing in the book might actually be achievable. So in the case of Seven Eves, for example, there's a lot of material in there having to do with orbital mechanics, which is it's not a trivial subject, but it's the basic math of conic sections and orbits and so on has been very well understood for a long time. So it's a matter of simply kind of transferring those equations into Mathematica and then running the numbers. In the case of Termination Shock, I had aspirations early of trying to get my head around some of the climate models that are out there, which are very complicated, very powerful models, but didn't really have the time to plunge into that. So there's nothing in the book that is based on actual simulation of the atmosphere, but what I did do was try to do some calculations on the performance of the gun, the big gun that the air in the story constructs in West Texas to launch shells full of sulfur into the air. And so I can't vouch for it completely. I mean, nobody's reviewed the notebook that I created and for showstoppers, but I think that in general terms, the numbers pencil out on that system, and it yields a kind of the key number that falls out of it is the amount of sulfur that gets delivered into the stratosphere per year while this thing is running. And I think it's enough of a number to make a detectable difference, but not a big enough number to fully counteract the effects of too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But even that has desirable and useful knock-on effects in the development of the plot, because that enables me then to say, well, okay, if he's built this thing and it works, but it's not big enough to completely achieve his goal, then that implies that he's going to need to build other systems like it in other parts of the world. And where would those be built? What political accommodations would he need to arrive at in order to get permission to build and operate these things? And how does that then fall through into various geopolitical considerations that I can have some fun with as a writer?
I've heard it said that when authors write about the future, there's a mix of things going on. Their predictions, some of them are things they think are likely, some are things they think should happen, and others are just there to make a good story. So I want to run through some of the aspects or some elements of our potential climate future and sort of see where you fall on those. So I think you mentioned a little bit very briefly about carbon dioxide removal, but in terms of emissions cuts and carbon dioxide removal, I mean, what do you think are the prospects of us achieving the kind of rapid emissions cuts that would be necessary to limit warming to 1.5 Celsius without solar geoengineering, I should say?
So I don't follow this extremely closely. My sense is that the cuts needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees seem extremely optimistic, and I'll be very pleasantly surprised if those actually happen. I'm all in favor of any efforts that get made in that area, but it seems like a lot of countries are going to have to make very big changes in their economies in order to hit that.
Is it possible to dramatize the kind of decades-long energy transition that we're talking about? I mean, as you mentioned, your focus is on big technologies, and there are big technologies in realizing emissions cuts and carbon dioxide removal, but they're of a different character from solar geoengineering.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, and it's a fundamental part of the problem here. In that, for a different kind of big goal, like let's build a Mars colony, that can be realized through some very charismatic and singular technologies, building giant rockets, launching them into space, and so on and so forth. And there's an element of human adventure tied in with that kind of project as well, where, we get to see the individual stories of astronauts and what happens to them, be it good or bad. And as you point out, the problem with emission reduction and with carbon capture is that these are projects that are distributed across the entire surface of the globe, and they take place in industries that don't have that inherently charismatic quality to them. So it's a lot more difficult to kind of capture the imagination of a reader or anybody who's not, a process engineer, in undertaking those kinds of projects. And yet we have to do it.
I guess on the other side of things, I believe there are quite a lot of stories about how the impacts of climate change could play out in the future. So what worries you most about climate change? Well,
I think the big bad is wet bulb events, where the heat and the humidity in a particular area become so high that survival of unprotected human beings is physically impossible. And if events like that happen in heavily populated areas, there could be mass fatality events. And in his book, The Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson opens with a very powerful and well wrought depiction of one such event. And so, I mean, we've brushed up against this a few times already, and even in my hometown of Seattle, we had a heat bubble last summer where the temperature went up to something like 115 Fahrenheit for 3 days, and then dropped by 50 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. So, but in its wake, it left a couple of hundred fatalities. So that's the big bad. But then there's, as you know, a whole list of other negative effects of climate change. Maybe not as dramatic as that, but potentially even more damaging in kind of pervasive ways when you integrate them over the whole surface of the Earth, decades of time.
I guess in your story, sea level rise features quite prominently as a concern. Was there a reason to focus on sea level rise over these other risks?
Yeah, a couple reasons. One is that I didn't want to write. It's tempting to write about huge, dramatic, horrific disasters, and I didn't want to play that card. But the key reason is that sea level rise can't be argued with. So you can, if there's a heat wave, people are always going to say that it's just a random anomaly. Well, we've always had heat waves. There's no proof that this doesn't prove that there's global climate change. And it's not such a big deal. But in the case of sea level rise, you cannot argue with the fact that your house is full of water, or that there are streets in your town that are underwater that were not underwater just a few years ago. And it's worldwide, so it affects every place that's along a coast. So it affects a lot of people. It's easily visualized, and it provides an economic motivation to do something. So the actors that we see in kind of the opening chapters of the book all have one thing in common, which is that they represent countries where rising sea levels pose kind of an existential threat to them. And so they're all kind of, despite being otherwise very diverse and distributed around the world, they're all brought together by a shared existential concern with this one phenomenon.
And finally, to solar geoengineering. So in your story, stratospheric aerosol geoengineering is deployed unilaterally by a billionaire. Do you think this is likely, or?
I think that some kind of solar geoengineering is going to be implemented within the next couple of decades, but I don't think it's going to be by a lone billionaire. So there's some places. Sometimes I make decisions for storytelling purposes that may not be entirely realistic. In this case, it's simply more interesting and makes for a more fun and readable story if the person who does it is a person as opposed to a committee or a coalition of countries or something like that. And that's just kind of storytelling 101. And I have to sort of bend over backwards a little bit to explain how he's able to get away with it. In other words, why doesn't he just get shut down by governmental authorities? So there is a story to explain that, but it's a story that requires some effort on my part. So I think that that the emission reduction goals, which are laudable and which I'm all in favor of, are not going to happen fast enough to prevent very serious consequences of climate change, and that there are going to be countries in the world who take a look at this situation, who run the numbers, and who simply conclude it's in their own national best interests to take action and try to cool things. So I would not be at all surprised to see it happen, but I don't think it'll be a lone wealthy individual. I think it'll be one or more countries.
I guess one thing with sci-fi books, when they predict, well, not so predict is the right word, but if they forecast the future in some way, there seems to be maybe two ways that they could take on a development. One is to foreground it and make it a core part of the story, and another is to have it as a background element. Oh, by the way, we can fly to Mars or whatever it is. Which do you think is more likely? Is the development of solar geoengineering likely to be a foreground issue or more of a background issue?
That's a question that is more interesting to talk about than it is to have an answer to, because it could go either way, and the initial kind of my knee-jerk answer is that, oh well, it's such a big dramatic kind of thing that that it's got to be in the foreground, and that's certainly the decision I've made with Termination Shock. But I did a book tour appearance last week with David Keith at Harvard, in which he raised the idea that maybe it's not that dramatic. That if it were done right and done in a controlled and measured way, that could be just sort of a thing that exists in the background, as you say, and doesn't impress itself on in their day-to-day lives very much.
I listened to that talk with David Keith. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I'm increasingly thinking personally, the more that I look at solar geoengineering, that it might be a bit more boring than a lot of people speculate. And an analogy that I increasingly draw upon to think about how it might fit into society, into planning, isn't nuclear weapons or whatnot. It's not these big centralized technologies, but it's monetary policy, which is
incredibly boring, but pervasive.
Right. So it involves models. There's uncertainties. There's asymmetries of power between countries. There's not a centralized global decision maker. We have the IMF sort of coordinates some policy and shares some information. Sometimes countries bicker about it, about, the exchange rate or the interest rate or whatnot. But the forecast of a war over monetary policy is outlandish. And it's not on the front page news, the monetary policy. Well, sometimes it is during economic crisis, but usually it's page 24. I think solar geo, if it is used, might recede into this background of something that's normal. It's got its ups and downs and there's disagreements, but page 24.
I would add another analogy, which is just oil and mining industry, which happen on an incredibly huge scale, but they happen far away from. And so even well-informed persons, when they go and visit a major oil field or a big mining operation, are just gobsmacked by how big it is. But if you're not driving by it every day, you're not even aware of its existence.
In your book, in Termination Shock, the language and perception of solar geoengineering is highly important, perhaps even more important than the impacts. For example, at one point in time, the media coverage of solar geoengineering is described by one character as being much wrong, and the chattering classes were knocked off balance quite badly. That there's multiple layers here. There's the physical, and then there's the linguistic and the perception. And in my experience, people really do seem to have this deep affective reaction to solar geoengineering, especially those who are most involved in environmental issues and climate change, that it touches something deep. What might that mean for the ultimate politics of solar geoengineering? Is this going to play out in ways that cut across traditional political coalitions? Is there a serious, if not insurmountable, perception problem among those who are most active in the relevant issue areas? How might this play out in the next decade or so?
Agreed. Some people have a very visceral negative reaction to it, and it's easy to see why. A lot of people who are environmentally conscious, I think, have sort of a narrative in their heads that there is this thing called the natural world, that was pristine. And that everything that humans have done has tended to degrade it and make it worse. And so this seems like an egregious example of that. Like more recent research has tended to suggest that that it's been a really long time since there was a truly natural world unaffected by human activity. In North America, for example, when Europeans arrived, they tended to think of it as an unspoiled wilderness, but there's strong arguments to be made that the people who got there before them had massacred all of the megafauna that had been living there when they arrived, and then turned large chunks of the continent into basically parks or gardens that were managed by wildfire and other techniques to give them the food that they wanted. It was all beautiful. It's how we get the Great Plains. It's how we get the Amazon rainforest, but none of it is natural in any sense. A bit of a digression there, but point being that if that's your kind of grounding narrative for our relationship to the world, then messing with the weather seems terrible, even though we've already been messing with it for hundreds of years. So, and there's also kind of the precautionary principle, which has taken hold in the last few decades in the wake of disastrous things that we did, like introduction of DDT and some of the early mishaps with nuclear power. So solar geoengineering cuts across all of those grains quite dramatically. All I would say is that it seems like the tide is beginning to turn, at least for nuclear power. So a lot of environmentalists were the kinds of people who formerly would hate and do everything to oppose nuclear power are coming around to the view that we just have to do it, as a way of reducing carbon emissions. So it could be that as awareness spreads of the severity of the problems that we're facing, and the danger of possible mass fatality events, wars, and so on, as a result of climate change, that people will begin to come around to the view.
As I was reading Termination Shock on the heels of taking in Seven Eves, there were two significant features to both plots that stood out to me, something they had in common. I was looking for commonalities between them. They're really quite different books, in subject matter and approach and scale and tone. But two things jumped out to me, and I'd like to touch on each of these. The first of which is the balance of power between government and private individuals, in that each story was to some degree driven by a very wealthy individual who pushed an issue in a way that government wasn't. For whatever reason, the government wasn't acting.
Yeah.
And some might argue that something that's going on now, there's a number of ventures, particularly on the outer frontier of our planet and beyond, where the extremely wealthy are, one could say innovative, the other one could say colonizing, or something with a more critical tone. Is this new? Is this a trend? Or is this more cyclical? Is this a rehash of the way that the fabulously wealthy of the Victorian era were pushing in ways that the government was unable or unwilling to do so?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. We can always find historical examples of wealthy people who push for things. I would say even the most powerful Victorians were doing what they did in the context of a larger kind of imperial governmental system, whereas what we're seeing now seems to involve greater agency on the part of the billionaires and much less on the part of institutions. So it's clearly the case that that for better or worse, we are now looking to billionaires to solve problems for us that half a century ago we would have delegated to governments or the military or other big social institutions, and it's not hard to see why that's the case. The very wealthy people now are unbelievably wealthy. They're not just rich people, but the amount of money that they've got as a proportion of the total wealth that exists is incredibly high. And at the same time, our institutions, at least in kind of Western democracies, have become kind of weak and undermined and deadlocked politically, so that they're not able to really act in a very effective way. So you can kind of see this, like most strikingly right now, you can see it with NASA trying to get the iteration loop of its planning to catch up with the speed at which SpaceX is making new things available. And So any plan that they come up with is sort of, by the time they've come up with it, is obsolete because of new developments in private space launch. So when when someone gets inside of your decision loop, then you're basically paralyzed. So I don't necessarily advocate that state of affairs as the best way to organize a society, but it's clearly kind of where we are right now. And so, it just, again, kind of putting on my storyteller hat, that was the kind of the raw material that I had.
The other aspect that I found common in the two books was the role of modeling. Right. So computer models, you mentioned this in the context, of course, of climate change and of solar geoengineering. What will the impacts be? Who will benefit? Who might be harmed? How might precipitation change, for example? In Seven Eves, there's, without revealing too much around the plot, there's some processes whose course is difficult to determine, but it starts to look to be very consequential for all of humanity. And I look around and I see climate modeling, and I see, to circle back around, economic modeling and increasing role of algorithms and artificial intelligence. And is it the case that as humanity confronts more and more complex problems, first we get our food and our shelter, and we move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we create these enormously complex societies sustained by complex systems and intricate technologies, is this sort of reliance upon modeling, which is beyond the perception of the average voter, to some degree an inevitable or at least a likely stage of human development? And what does this mean for democracy if we can't see what's under the hood? If the voters can't see what's going on under the hood, is there a technocratic magnet to human development?
Yeah, it's a really important and fundamental question, which I think a great many, even well-informed voters may not be seeing. Certain phenomena are just so complicated that it's beyond the power of individual humans to really put the whole picture together and come up with an accurate understanding of what the future holds. And a classic example that's relatively simple is just the whole idea of exponential growth. And we saw the difficulties that people have in coming to grips with that during the early stages of the pandemic, where you plot the trend lines, then somebody who understands basic mathematics will look at the curve and say, oh my God, this is exponential. And what this means is that we're going to see 10,000 cases and then 100,000 and then 1 million very, very quickly. And someone who doesn't grasp what exponentials are may just see kind of a line that's curving upward and not. And these climate models and that sort of thing are far more complicated than merely projecting an exponential curve. They're also understandable only by a fairly small number of pretty elite researchers and scientists, which for me, it doesn't bother me personally, but it does bother a lot of people that when they see that important decisions are being made, based on things that can be understood by a select few. So it is that's where it turns into a serious issue for democracies, particularly, and for politics in general. And it's a completely legit question to ask whether how power and decision-making authority should be apportioned in situations like that. And how can we as a society make well-informed decisions in these situations without ceasing to be democratic? I don't know the answer. I'm just.
it's a tough nut to crack. I struggle with the same issues. I have a Democrat, lowercase d, Democrat on one shoulder and a technocrat on the other shoulder, both whispering in my ear at all times as I work through my thinking, and both appeal. Diving into something a bit longer term, but not entirely different. Are you familiar with David Grinspoon's book, Earth in Human Hands?
No.
It's and he may present an idea that's more common, but this is a book that struck me and really left an imprint on me. He's an astrobiologist. So he's asking the question, how might we detect intelligent life in space? And he says, well, maybe oxygen isn't the signal we're looking for if we're really looking for intelligent life. What we're looking for is managed planets, because environmental issues are a type of a filter, and they're going to destroy some percentage of intelligent species, and others are going to work their way through. And that period, that filtering period, is just, in astrological time, just a blink of an eye. So it's very unlikely that we'll be finding possible species that are anywhere near our stage of development. They're either worms or they've gone through this filter.
Right.
And this got me thinking a lot about solar geoengineering, which is also something that's in this book, is looking toward the longer term as we think about society confronting even more challenging problems, such as climate change, arguably one of the most difficult challenges that humanity has confronted. It may be the case that some type of planetary management is at least a temporary way out. And there's other avenues of planetary management. You spoke of Native Americans burning the plains as a type of landscape management. Is it at least logical, or what's your reaction to the prospect of the course of increasingly complex and developed life on a planet eventually reaching the stage of planetary and Earth systems management?
By the way, you might already know this, but the track that Freeman Dyson was on when he came up with the idea of a Dyson sphere was how could we detect presence of intelligent civilizations from a great distance? And given the equipment that we had at the time for taking astronomical observations, and his idea was that the natural end state for an advanced civilization would be to enclose their whole star, a Dyson sphere. And at that point, if you looked at that location, you wouldn't see anything that looked like a star, but you'd see an infrared source radiating just infrared, nothing else, in a particular band that was compatible with carbon-based life. And if you saw something like that, the only possible explanation would be that it was a star that had been completely surrounded by matter. So, and I suppose with better astronomical equipment, we might be able to look at a planet, not just a star, but a planet around another star. And if we saw fluctuations in albedo that were hard to explain naturally, we could conclude that this was a civilization that was, solar geoengineering to manage its weather. But as I was saying before, I think the a difficult kind of transformation that we would have to pass through on a way to accepting the whole idea. It sort of does away for good with the idea of nature as a thing that we can ever get back to. That is such a deeply embedded notion in people's way of thinking that there will be a lot of grieving in letting that go. But if we stay on the course we're on with the growth of population and so on, then I think that kind of management is going to be imposed one way or the other, either in a sort of top-down, controlled, organized way, or just by individual countries taking whatever action they think best suits their national security requirements.
As we come towards wrapping this up, I thought we'd talk a little bit about what worries you and perhaps what gives you hope. So with climate change, we've talked quite a bit about the risks and what you're worried about. But how do you think those risks will compare to the other risks that we face as we go through the 21st century and maybe a little beyond?
Like other risks at a comparable level of disastrousness would be smallpox and or something comparable to smallpox, and the possibility of nuclear war, and if another one would be if you kind of extrapolate the negative effects of social media into the future, and if those keep getting worse and we don't come up with a better immune system, we could end up in a world where we've completely lost our grip on facts, and we're just being controlled by whoever the biggest asshole is. So those would be effects on a comparable scale to climate change. But they're all kind of unpredictable, whereas the effects of climate change seem pretty inevitable. It's been building, the CO2 level has been building up for a good couple of 100 years now. It's continuing to rise. The rate at which it's rising is still going up. It's going to keep going up for at least a couple of decades. When it stops going up, it's not going to go down until we physically remove the carbon. So for sure, this is a problem that exists and that is not going away, and that we're going to have to contend with. And we have to contend with it while also keeping an eye on some of those other less predictable risks that I
was a little surprised that you didn't mention AI, because it seems many thinkers of all sorts of stripes are worried about AI for a couple of reasons, I guess. One might be sort of the economic, social disruption side of things, and the other is some form of robot takeover. Or do these prospects worry you, or how do you feel about those kind of ideas?
I would, at least for the time being, I would consider the social media to be that. I think essentially what we've done is handed our ability to perceive and understand reality over to AIs, which are the algorithms that run social media sites and that determine what we do and don't see in the way of news feeds and so on. And the difference from the scenario you're talking about is that a lot of times when people worry about AI, what they worry about is some kind of sentient AI that's got intentionality, that has motives and goals, and that tries to achieve those goals kind of in the way that a human actor would. But that's not necessarily the case. And in the case of social media, what we've got is AIs that don't really have a big goal or a big motive other than to increase engagement and get more clicks. And it just happens that a byproduct of them achieving that goal or pursuing that goal is the destruction of our civil society. So if AI is the bad actor we need to worry about, I don't think it's going to be some kind of super brain that takes over, but it's going to be inflicting casualties on the human race as a kind of unintended byproduct of some other thing that it's programmed to do.
Another technological strand that some worry about, and I'm not sure how much you've written about this, is biotechnology. I think it was quite popular in sci-fi imaginings in the 90s and 2000s, and in the recent decade or so, it really is, the capabilities have really exploded. What do you feel about the developments there?
I mean, it's not hard to envision all kinds of ways that it could go wrong. I think that the big bad in that scenario is a disease that spreads like COVID, but has even worse effects. So I mentioned smallpox earlier. A possible bad outcome of biotechnology is that somebody synthesizes that, it's loose. So So maybe it's that, and maybe it's some other thing that's similarly contagious and virulent and deadly. But I mean, for sure, that is a thing to worry about. I just think it's more likely to be a new variant of something we already know about than it's easier to just synthesize something we already know about than to try to engineer a completely strain from the ground up.
Okay, so those are all some quite a dystopic few strands there. What are some utopic strands that you can see in the future? What gives you hope?
I think that I'm beginning to see technically sophisticated people turning their attention to carbon capture, and I think that carbon capture is a somewhat attractive project for nerds because it's definitely got some challenges. It's not easy, and nerds like that kind of thing. It would have to be implemented on an incredibly enormous scale, so it's got there's a certain kind of interest value created just in the idea of making something that's that big, and it's there's absolutely no question that it's a positive good. So one can argue with geoengineering, solar geoengineering, and say, oh, well, we shouldn't be messing with the climate that way. And so, okay, maybe there's, credible arguments to be made along those lines. But the removal of excess carbon dioxide or carbon from the atmosphere is absolutely a good thing to do. It's us undoing something we shouldn't have ever done in the first place, and so I'm hoping that that becomes sufficiently interesting to people who know how to get things done, that people begin to sort of turn their careers toward and making it their life's work. And I think that if it does begin to take hold, which won't happen for a few decades, but that if it does, it'll change our overall way of thinking about everything, and maybe get us out from under the cloud of general dystopic and dread that is pervasive now.
So I guess then, kind of related to that, do you think the 22nd century looks brighter than the 21st century?
If we get there, I do think so. Yeah. It's just we're right now having to deal with a kind of a double whammy in the form of both serious climate change issues combined with the kind of breakdown of exactly the institutions and mindset that we need in order to tackle those problems. So that's a pretty tough set of challenges. But I prefer to take the optimistic view that we'll figure out a way to muddle through and turn the corner at some point.
Our guest today has been science fiction and speculative fiction author Neal Stephenson. His latest book, which we highly recommend, is Termination Shock. Neal, thanks for joining us on Challenging Climate.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to Challenging Climate. Our music is by Peter Dalchuk, and our website is challengingclimate.org, where you can find the show notes for this episode, including all the relevant links and references. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it on social media to help us grow this podcast.